Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com.
Hello, I'm Major General George Gordon Meade, and I am the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm a native of Pennsylvania and of Philadelphia. I'm a West Point graduate. I was a 25-year veteran of the United States Army. I was in the Corps of Engineers. At the beginning of the war, when the Volunteer Army was created, of course I was in the regular Army. I was a captain in the Corps of Engineers, but the volunteer service was created with 300,000 and 500,000, then 1 million men, and they needed competent commanders. So I made myself available for the volunteer service, and I was promoted Brigadier General of Pennsylvania Volunteers, commanding a brigade in the 2nd Brigade of the Pennsylvania Volunteer Reserve Corps, Pennsylvania Reserves, which is a division entirely composed of Pennsylvanians. And we saw service with that division in most of the beginning of the war. So I've been around since the beginnings of the war. So my first major service would have been on the Peninsula Campaign under General McClellan, another Philadelphian, where we attacked Richmond, the Confederate capital, of course, via the peninsula between the York River and the James River. And I saw service there at the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, and then in the Peninsula 7 Days Campaign. And the 7 Days Campaign, of course, was composed of 7 days in which there was a battle every day. And finally, next to the last day of the battle, June 30th, 1862, at what's known as the Battle of Glendale, a very, very vicious and pivotal battle that people don't know about very much, but it could have ended the war right there had the Confederates been successful in driving through us and driving us into the James River. And my troops were sent, and I was ordered to hold that spot, that crossroads at Glendale, Fraser's Farm, at all hazards. And we did that. We fought viciously, 8 charges and countercharges over the guns and dead artillerymen and horses, until finally a gap opened, and I rode to the last reserve regiment and led them into the battle. And I was shot and almost killed at that battle. I was shot through the lungs, will impair me, and I will have respiratory problems the rest of my life. I did return home for about 50 days. Leave. I did recover, and I returned in time for the Second Bull Run campaign. This is August of 1862, and we were part of the Army of Virginia under General Pope, and that resulted, of course, in the bitter defeat of the Second Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates call it Second Manassas. After that, General Lee was emboldened to try to invade the North. He'd always planned to do that, to win a decisive victory. McClellan returned to command of the Army of the Potomac. We joined the Army of the Potomac and became part of the 1st Corps under General Hooker. And we marched to South Mountain, where we fought in the gaps, and then onto the battlefield at Antietam, at Sharpsburg. And that is the bloodiest day in American history up to this date, whatever this date may be, with 24,000 casualties, both sides being Americans in one day. I was commanding the division of the Pennsylvania Reserves in the cornfield, Miller's Cornfield, when I received an order placing me in command of the 1st Corps. General Hooker had been wounded. Even though I was a junior commander, I was placed in command by General McClellan, showing his regard perhaps for my ability. After that, I returned to command of my division. A new Army commander takes charge, General Burnside, and he will embark upon the Fredericksburg campaign. This will be December 1862, and it will result in a very bitter defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862. I was in command of the division of the Pennsylvania Reserves on the left flank at Prospect Hill. And apparently through a mix-up in orders, a unit was ordered to assault the Confederate works there in order to have a feint so as to allow our army in town to assault the Maurice Heights and win a victory there. So I was picked, my division was picked to be the suicide charge, and we charged across the Slaughter Farm. Interesting name, but that was the name of the family. And there, lo and behold, we actually break through the Confederate lines. We got in behind Stonewall Jackson's lines, and we could feel victory. The problem was that no one suspected we would ever be able to do that, and therefore there were no reserves to come up and relieve us. And therefore there was only one option, and that was to retire. And in the course of retiring, with firing front and both flanks, we lost 40% of our men in the Pennsylvania reserves. After that, there are some consternation and morale problems in the Army, and a new commander will take over, Joe Hooker. And Hooker will, in January, end of January 1863, I will be promoted to the command because I was a major general at that point, as approved by Congress in the reserve, in the volunteer service. And I was raised to the command of the 5th Corps. In the Army of the Potomac, there were 7 infantry corps, a cavalry corps, and an artillery corps, which was called the Artillery Reserve. And so I was leading the 5th Corps, and some people considered the 5th Corps the best corps in the Army. Why? Not because of me, but because it contained the division of the regulars. All the regular professional soldiers were gathered together in the 2nd Division of the 5th Corps. And I was proud as a regular to be commanding them, along with, of course, the volunteer troops. What will ensue is May 1863, where we have the Chancellorsville campaign. This was an attempt by our Army, which outnumbered the Confederates over 2-1, almost 3-1 at that time, near Fredericksburg. And we were going to outflank them through the wilderness and then drive them into the city and defeat them there, we hoped. That was the hope and the plan. And I was in charge of the 5th Corps. I was given the burden of the advance of the Army up 25 miles up the Rappahannock River, then crossing over the Rappahannock, Rapidan, and then coming down through the wilderness and driving the Confederates before me. We were doing that very successfully. Not a whole lot of action at that point. We reached the great plateau there where Chancellorsville, it's not a town, it's a building, a large building on the Orange Turnpike, and there I received orders to hold and wait for Hooker. Hooker will arrive. And the next day he orders an assault on the Confederates. They had time, of course, to bring up reserves, and I was driving them nicely on May the 1st, 1863, when I received an order, pull back. And I said, why? We're doing well. The plan is working. What's going on? I was sent back, and they said, orders confirmed, pull back. And I came back to Chancellorsville, and I came to General Hooker, and I said, General Hooker, what's the problem? We were succeeding. We were driving the enemy. We were almost to our goals. What happened? He said, it's suspicious. Lee has something up his sleeve. We must pull back and wait his attack. And so at that point, he had given over, he had lost his nerve and had given over the initiative in the fighting to General Lee. It was a very, very bitter defeat. We were forced to recross the Rappahannock River to Falmouth, losing 17,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, of course. So a lot of demoralization, and of course, General Lee is going to take advantage of this demoralization by deciding to reinvade the North. He'd always wanted to do that. He was stopped at Antietam. And why was he going to invade the North? He wanted a decisive victory on Northern soil. First of all, he could provision himself off the riches of the North, get supplies and so on. But if he could defeat our best army, capture Washington, capture Philadelphia, who knows, it may have resulted in some form of independence for the Confederacy, which we could not allow, of course. So he begins to advance in June, up the valley, or pardon me, down the valley into the north, and he reaches Pennsylvania by June 27th, 1863. He's loose in this rich farmland. He's subsisting off the ground, off the people, taking supplies in, horses, animals, and no Union troops anywhere to be beheld. Some militia forming, but that was it. So at that point, General Hooker is relieved of command for many, many different political reasons. I won't get into that. And that meant that one of the corps commanders, the lieutenants of the Army, had to take over because they couldn't call a halt to the invasion and then go look for somebody else somewhere else, such as General Thomas. He was 1,000 miles away in Mississippi. So it had to be someone on the site. And so I was compromise candidate. When I was nominated, no one knew me. I have no political agenda. I just do my duty to the best of my ability. And Lincoln was heard to say, well, Meade should do well on his own dunghill. Dunghill meaning Pennsylvania. Of course, the voters didn't know about that, so they did re-elect him in 1864. So I was promoted. I was ordered to take command at 3 a.m. on the morning of June 28th. I was awakened from my uneasy slumber, my tent outside of Frederick, Maryland, and ordered to take command. At first, I declined because I didn't think I was capable. And there were better men, such as General Reynolds, who might do a better job. And they said, no, this is an order. You must execute the order. It's peremptory. And so I said, well, I have never refused a legitimate order from higher authorities, therefore I accept, but knowing full well the difficulties and burdens that I had assumed. And so I gathered General Reynolds, for example. He met me to congratulate me. I said, don't congratulate me, you should commiserate with me. And I found out that he had actually been offered the command, but had turned it down. At that point, we weren't in the invasion, and he had the leeway to be able to do that. And I said, John, help me beat these people. And we came up with the plan which will result in the Battle of Gettysburg. I have to give him all the credit for that, the suggestions, recommendations, and his advice. And of course, he will be killed on the first day of the battle. And I will lose not only my best friend, but also one of our greatest leaders and military commanders, and he was killed on July the 1st, 1863 here. So what was the plan? Basically, it was, we knew that Lee was loose in Pennsylvania, probably a 60, 70 mile front, all the way from the Susquehanna in the east to Greensburg in the west, and mountains in between. And what we were going to do, we can't cover all of that ground. So we reasoned that Lee would probably want to stay close to the mountains in case of a reverse, that he could retreat behind the mountains for cover. And but still stay on the eastern side in case he wanted to give battle to our army. He found out that we were approaching rapidly in his rear. He called all his troops from various sections, all the way from Harrisburg to the Susquehanna and in the Cumberland Valley, all the way back to consolidate east of the mountains near Cashtown initially. And so I sent my cavalry forward as a screen. Some people say I handled the cavalry the best that had ever been handled. And of course, the cavalry had come of age. They had become the equal of the Confederate cavalry, which was not the case earlier in the war. And I gave General Reynolds 1/3 of my army, 3 corps, to go forward on the left near the point where we thought they would consolidate, and to have a reconnaissance in force. And if he found that ground to be favorable, to stay and fight, and if not, to fall back to a superior defensive position. As he fell back, he would get stronger because he was closer to the reserves and his supplies and so on. And so he went forward, he saw the ground, he chose to fight west and north of the town of Gettysburg, because it's the rolling hills and so on, good defensive positions. And he was placing troops, the Iron Brigade, in line early in the morning, about 10:30 in the morning, when he was shot and killed by a Confederate bullet. And we lost our commander on the field, and one of my best friend and a great leader of men in the Union Army. So the first day's fight will be a complete Confederate victory. They had more troops closer to the action. They drove our forces back. We solidified south of the town on high ground. And fortunately, I was able to send General Hancock forward to make some sense of the chaos. And I finally broke camp. I was at Taneytown, Maryland at the time. And I came up about midnight onto the field of Gettysburg. So I missed the first day's battle, which was a complete Confederate victory. But we were tenacious. We wanted to stand and fight. This is our home territory. And so I came forward, reconnoitered the lines, and created the defensive position that will become the famous fishhook line. Thank you very much. I hope that summarizes somewhat all the fighting in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Thank you.
I am Brigadier General John Buford. I was born in 1826 in Woodford County, Kentucky, into a slaveholding family. I was appointed to West Point. Graduated in the middle of my class in 1847. I was commissioned with the Dragoons and sent west. When the war broke out in 1861, I was stationed at Fort Crittenden, Utah. I got a letter from the governor of Kentucky My good friend John Gibbon was in my room, and I told him I got this letter. I was offered any rank and commission, any command I wanted in the Confederate Army if I would just come home and serve. Gibbon asked me, "What'd you say, John?" And I told him that I'm a captain in the United States Army, and I reckon I'm going to stay one. A man's only allowed 3 oaths in his life, and that's to his God and to his country and to his spouse, and you should never, ever go back on any one of them. So I did stay in the Union. Was called back to Washington, D.C., and was made Adjutant General of the Cavalry, which mostly was a desk job, and I did not like that. I wanted a field command, which I was given in 1862. First major action was Second Battle of Manassas. My division was tasked with covering the retreat, unfortunately, of the Union Army. I was shot there. I was wounded. I was knocked from the saddle. The reports were that I had been killed in action, and in fact, the Army was preparing and making funeral plans for me. However, I chose to skip that funeral and return back to active duty, again as a division commander of the United States Cavalry. As we move forward, we had several other engagements. There was 2 things I really did not like. I did not like reporters or spies. In fact, if I had to choose one, I would prefer a spy over a reporter because at least they were honorable. They had a cause they were working for. In fact, we caught a spy on our way through Maryland in 1863. We caught him in our camps at breakfast time. We gave him a fair trial, and we had him hung by 10 o'clock that morning. So it was a pretty efficient process that we were able to utilize those days. But as we were moving north from Virginia up through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, I was the left front of the Union Army, commanding 1st Division, United States Cavalry, Army of the Potomac. We knew there was large numbers of Confederate forces just to our west, behind the mountains and ridges. We came up the Emmitsburg Road, and as we were coming into Gettysburg, we saw a brigade of Confederate soldiers leaving Gettysburg. Apparently they had gotten word that we were arriving, and they were headed west towards Cashtown as we came into town. So as we did some additional reconnaissance, I sent messages back to both General Reynolds and General Meade that the Confederates are massed here just west of this town in mass. They were in large numbers. We didn't know how many of the Confederate corps were there, but we knew at least one. We had captured a couple of prisoners that were from A.P. Hill's corps, so we knew he was here. So that night of June 30th, I started to deploy vedettes as far west as 5 miles west of town, up on Hers Ridge, and we also posted on McPherson Ridge, and we also posted on Seminary Ridge. Our job was to hold the Confederates out of town, because as we rode into town, I saw the ridge line south of town that I knew would be great defensive position. If we could get our infantry there in time, we could hold that position and still entice the Confederates to attack us and probably defeat them totally over a period of time if we could hold that position, which we did, which is what our intent was. I sent that message to General Reynolds, and he concurred also through couriers. So we had our vedettes posted the night of June 30th. We could see large numbers of Confederate campfires off to the west. That morning, Harry Heath brought his division in towards Gettysburg because they believed that we were a militia and that they would brush us aside. I had 2,400 troopers with me, only 2 of my 3 brigades. And a fourth of those men had to hold horses, so we were down to under 2,000 active men. In order to convince the Confederates that we were a big force and slow them down, and time was the essence, that was the big issue. We had to hold them out until the rest of the Army of the Potomac could arrive and occupy that hill and the ridge south of town. So instead of deploying a man every foot, I dismounted the troopers, deployed them about every 6 or 8 feet apart. Colonel Gamble's brigade on the left, Colonel Devon's brigade to the north. We made it appear as though we were a bigger force. I had a battery of cannons. Instead of putting them all in one spot like normal, I spread them out so that in fact it appeared as though we had 6 battery of cannons. Spreading our men out, all of my men were equipped with at least single-shot breech-loading carbines. I had a few with repeater Spencer rifles. However, if you're on a horseback carrying a rifle, that's really not all that convenient. So Most of them had single shots, some Burnsides, some Spencers, some Sharps. It was not consistent, but they were breech loaders. And on a single shot breech loader, you can fire about 6 or 7 well-aimed shots a minute. By spreading our men out with that much firepower, hitting the Confederate lines as they came into town, they did believe we were a much larger force of infantry, and so they slowed down. They deployed into battle lines. Took them another 2 hours. We started fighting and engaging them about 5:30 that morning, so we were able to slow them up quite a bit. It gave time for Reynolds Corps to arrive. By mid-morning, we all have a difference of opinion exactly what time that was, because our watches did not seem to all match with each other. But I can assure you, from the amount of fighting that we did, it was several hours that we were on our own. One division of cavalry with only 2 brigades, facing an entire Confederate corps of about 25,000 men. So we had to hold them off, and we did. And by mid to late morning, my perspective certainly is that it was closer to late morning than mid-morning. The lead units of the 1st Corps did arrive on the field. At that point in time, we were redeployed to the left and right flanks of the infantry to help cover the flanks and, in case necessary, to cover a retreat. The fighting continued all day. We then were, in fact, the last units on the field as the infantry retreated back through town and up onto Cemetery Hill. It was my cavalry brigades that covered that retreat. And in fact, our last casualties were late in the afternoon of July 1st, after the infantry had made it back onto Cemetery Hill, and my men were trying to get back up on the hill. We were fired upon with friendly fire, and my last casualties were, in fact, friendly fire from the infantry forces up on Cemetery Hill. That night we were deployed off to the right with Devon's brigade over to the right by Culp's Hill, Gamble's brigade to the left in front of Cemetery Hill. We stayed there overnight and then observed the movements of Confederate troops early in the morning of July 2nd to the south and or our left, and we were reporting that. With that, I can tell you, while some people think the Confederates won on the first day, I would offer that it was exactly the opposite. We accomplished our goals specifically. We held the Confederates in place instead of having General Lee move his army to Harrisburg. We gave them a reason to stay in Gettysburg area to fight. We held them off long enough for the rest of the Union Army to arrive on site. We did exactly what our intention was. To me, that makes a battle a win.
My name is Brigadier General Lysander Cutler. I am commander of the 2nd Brigade, 1st Corps, 1st Division, Army of the Potomac. I was born in Massachusetts. I moved to Maine. During those times, I was a school teacher. I owned a wool company, and I was also colonel of the Maine militia. 1856, I moved to a better climate, so I went to Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, it was 2 years before the war. I was a surveyor for the railroad. I maneuvered around the entire country. The war broke out, and they asked how many people in Wisconsin have military experience. Of course, I raised my hand. They put me colonel and had me help form the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers. During that time, the men of my company were all appointed by congressmen, senators, mayors, etc. Did not have a clue about what was going on in military life. What I did is I gave each one of my men and my officers, not the men, the officer men, a test. If these officers passed the test, they would stay where they were. If they did not pass the test, I removed them from position. Of course, no one loved me. Everyone hated me. The officers that I got rid of, I brought in officers that knew what they were doing. Most of them couldn't even speak English. The men resented me. However, the finest corps in the United States Army, 6th Wisconsin, part of the Iron Brigade. And I feel that between myself and Meredith, that's what we did. During the early morning of Fredericksburg campaign, we were held at the rear of General Meade's troop. We proceeded into the slaughter pen. However, because of fog, because of lousy weather, our activities weren't that much. We laid down in the field, we retreated, left Fredericksburg, have very few casualties. After that, moved up towards Gettysburg, took the long hike up the valley. While in Gettysburg, we camped at Marsh Run, 6 miles from town. Nice, pleasant place under the shade of oak trees. 3 a.m. that morning, I got word. Make all haste to Gettysburg. The Confederate Army is being held off by General Buford. It took us till 10:30 that morning to get to Gettysburg. We got there, the 2nd Brigade were the 1st Infantry on the field. Halfway there, 2 miles from the town, little more than halfway, we met General Reynolds. General Reynolds decided he's going to split my brigade. He sent me up, he sent the 84th New York, which is also called the 14th Brooklyn, and he also sent the 95th New York to the batteries off to the left, which were called the Maine batteries, the batteries from Maine, 6 guns. The remainder, the 95th New York, 56th Pennsylvania, and 147th New York, were deployed to the right of the railroad cut. We had my brigade split in half. The Iron Brigade followed us in, deployed them. Reynolds took personal charge of deploying them to the left of my position. So the Iron Brigade had 6 corps plus my 2 to hold off Archer and his people. Meanwhile, on the other side of the railroad cut, I had my 3 regiments. My 3 regiments had to hold off Davis and the rest of the Confederate Army as far as I was concerned. The battle lasted quite a long time. As far as I was concerned, it lasted almost forever. We were pushing and pushing the Confederates to a standstill. Davis came in, Heath came in, Rhodes started coming in from the north. The opposition we had was tremendous. We had orders from Wadsworth to fall back. And the reason I'm saying Wadsworth is because when Reynolds was positioning the Iron Brigade, he was killed in action. General Doubleday took over. Doubleday came back and he commanded everyone. He sent Wadsworth down to tell us to fall back. We fell back to Seminary Ridge. The Iron Brigade was still holding the people in place. Once at Seminary Ridge, the order to fall back was given, and the 147th New York, which was Colonel Miller, upon receiving the orders, was instantly killed. The 147th New York did not fall back. 95th, 56th, all were moving backwards. Now, Confederates came in and started to surround him. In the meantime, 6th Wisconsin, which was held in reserve, and the 84th, or the 14th, however you want to call them, and the 95th went to their relief, and by doing so, trapped the entire regiment in the railroad cut, taking thousands of prisoners. I would say thousands, might have been long hundreds. After that, we redeployed, moved forward again after Braxton's 2nd Division came up. He was being flanked on the left. My 147th 6th Wisconsin came in on the right of them and opened up such a volley that they were standing there. And it looked like they were ducking the volleys, but actually they were just falling dead. Threw down their muskets and surrendered. Some people say that the first day battle at Gettysburg was the 11th most casualties in the war. And my adjutant came to me and he gave me this. This is the casualty reports we have from my division, my brigade. 147th New York went in with 380 men. He's telling me there's 207 reported for muster. 76th New York had 348 men. Came back with 196. Same with 56th Pennsylvania. They lost 79 out of 235. All in all, my brigade started off with 2,015. I'm going to tell you now that when people say that the cost of holding the high grounds was great, these papers prove that. But we did. After that evening, we went to Cemetery Hill. We relaxed, re-ammoed, resupplied, rested. That morning at 3 a.m., they sent us up to Culp Hill. That was it for our 2nd day of the battle. That's where we stayed that evening.
Hi, I'm Sergeant Sullivan, James Patrick Sullivan. I'm with Company K of the 6th Wisconsin. And we were formed out of Mauston, Wisconsin. And we were the only Westerners to fight in the Eastern Theater with the Army of the Potomac. I've been engaged in several different battles, but here at Gettysburg, it's a little different than what we've encountered before. Early in the morning, and this was before sunrise, we were awakened, and this was on the 1st. We had time for a great fine breakfast of hardtack and coffee, but then we were ordered to pack up and get on the road and start heading north toward Gettysburg. Colonel Dawes was leading us, and we started off marching, and we marched for quite a bit before we ended up getting some daylight. And after the daylight, we were marching through and coming toward town. And some of the boys, they like to sing. So there was a unit right ahead of us, and they were Germans, their company. And they started singing, and boy, I'll tell you what, you've never heard such beautiful sound coming from men singing together. Of course, it seems kind of strange that we're singing on the way into a battle, but it's kind of how you take the edge off of what you know is coming later, so you focus on something else. And it was a good way to do it. Well, after the Germans finished singing, when we were marching in, well, we decided we were going to sing too. Of course, we sounded like a bunch of sick cows trying to sing, so it didn't last very long. Shortly after that, Gettysburg was coming into sight. So we formed up our straight lines so we'd come in through the town looking smart. General Gibbons always liked us to look like first-class military. And just as we were coming into town, the townspeople were meeting us and giving us bread, water. They had milk that they had brought out for us. We were filling our canteens, and we were taking whatever we could, and we were trying to eat something on the march, but still staying in our formal lines until we reached through town, and we could hear some cannon fire off on the right, some battles going on over there. And once we got up through town, we were ordered to turn to the left a little, and we got up by the seminary. And once we got up to the seminary, we just came down across the front toward the hill and we could see the battle going on. Well, General Reynolds had ordered and took up the 2nd and 7th Wisconsin. He'd taken the 19th Indiana and 24th Michigan, and he'd head straight into the wood line, right into the Confederates. Well, we were being held in reserve. We were still at the foot of the seminary, and there were some Confederates coming in from the north, and they were up on a hill coming through the woods. And when they came down across this field, it looked like the ground had swallowed them up. They just disappeared. Well, here they hadn't been swallowed up at all. They had gotten into a railroad cut, and they started firing. And they were firing at the right flank of Reynolds and our boys from the 2nd and 7th Wisconsin, and a couple of other regiments that were up on the hill there. I wasn't sure who all they were, but there was a couple other regiments taking some pretty heavy fire from those Confederates coming through. Well, a rider came up to us, to Colonel Dawes, and said, "General Reynolds has fallen. He's been taken from the field. We think he's dead. General Doubleday has taken command of the field, and he's ordered you and your group to head up into the railroad cut with 2 other regiments, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York." Well, we did, and we took lead with the 95th, and the 14th Brooklyn was on our left flank, and we went straight up into the railroad cut. But it wasn't real easy because we come down off the hill and we had to cross a road, and there was fences on both sides of the road. So we had to climb over the fence, cross the road, climb over the other fence and form up. Meanwhile, we're forming up, and some of our boys are dropping like flies. The Confederates are shooting us just as we're trying to load up and form our battle lines. Well, we ended up continuing. We continued straight on in, and we went right into it, and we found out when we got up there it was Davis's Mississippians who were in that cut. And I think there was another small group there with them, but the most of them were Davis's Mississippians. Well, that battle went on, and it seemed like it was going to be forever. We were just fighting our way through, and we got up to the edge of the cut, and when we were up on top and they were in the bottom, they were trying to get out, we all loaded up and fired. Well, as we were reloading, a lot of us jumped down into the cut. I'd gone up to one officer, and he had drawn his saber, and he went, and I thought he was going to try to strike, but he ended up turning his hilt and handing me the hilt of the saber as he was surrendering. And he went back to get his other boys to try to get them to put their weapons down, because they knew it was going to be a slaughter and they weren't going to win. Well, I had gone up the other side of the railroad cut toward the north side where they had come from, because it was a little lower. I was up there. Here, one of the big rebels, he had taken off. He was going to run back. He was heading west down the railroad line. Well, I ordered him to halt, and he wouldn't. So I took the saber, and I threw it at it with all my might. Well, when I turned my body, it felt like somebody hit me in the left shoulder with a sledgehammer. I went down to my knees, and I just wasn't quite sure what was going on. I was down for a while, and I was kind of disoriented. I don't know whatever happened to the rebel, or if I ever hit him with the sword. But I was down for a while, and once I started to regain my senses a little bit, I thought, well, like a good Irishman, I started to talk to myself. I said, "Well, Mickey, are you dead, or are you just wounded?" And I answered myself thinking, well, it must be the latter, because I haven't seen St. Peter yet. So I went to get up, and I did, and I went to reach for my musket, and I got it up, and I went to shoulder it with my left. My left arm wouldn't move. Well, here I'd been shot through the shoulder, and it was bleeding down through my uniform. And I stood there for a minute, and here Sergeant Tarbox, my sergeant, had come up the rank, out of the cut, and he looked at me and he said, "Mickey, they got you down, have they?" And a shot rang out, and he fell dead right in front of me. here one of them Rebs had loaded up. Even though he surrendered, he had his musket loaded. He shot him in the back and killed him right in front of me. Well, then he laid his musket down. The rebel did. Well, I'd gone back across the cut to the lower side because our men were forming up and they were taking the prisoners out. And they had them all lay the weapons down in the grass. Well, they had formed two lines, but our little skirmish lines were kind of thin because there weren't a whole lot of us left out of Company K and the 6th to escort all these prisoners off the field. So I formed up, held my musket with my right. And I'm walking along and I could feel the blood running down the inside of my coat, down my pants, and filling my shoe. And my left shoe was just squishing with blood coming out of it. Well, just then, old Daddy Wadsworth had rode up. He was our commander. He come up riding with, he had brought up some cavalry to help escort the prisoners off the field. Well, a sergeant was with him. A sergeant from the cavalry was with him. And Wadsworth looked at me and said, "Young man," he says, "I don't think you should be here doing this. You don't look too well." And he turned to the sergeant and said, "Sergeant," he said, "take this man into town to the hospital and don't leave him until he is seen by a doctor." Well, this good sergeant did. He helped me up on his horse, rode me into town. Well, on the way in, there was a lot of the townswomen out, and they had wine, they had water, they were given the wounded coming in whatever. They had some bandages that they had, and they were running back and forth into the different buildings you could see, and a lot of the buildings had turned into hospitals. Well, I was taken to the courthouse, where I'd run into a couple of doctors that I knew who were from our brigade. And I was talking to them for a minute, and they had me sit down, and well, they patched up my shoulder and put some kind of a mud patch on it and wrapped it up. And it gave me a couple swigs of brandy, and I went over and sat on the side in the corner, just kind of laid back against the wall. And I wasn't feeling too good. But I stayed there a while. And then when I got to feeling a little better, I did get up. And I started to mull around a little bit and talk to some of the other guys, and I was looking around. And I couldn't believe how many Company K men I seen in that hospital. One Tickner had his arm cut off, his left arm cut off. Another guy had his leg removed from the knee down. Another guy had his hip removed. It looked like it was a chunk of beef removed from his left side. Well, we were there for a while, and all of a sudden, we were told, a rider came in and said, well, the 11th Corps was here, but they're pulling back, and they're moving up to Culp's Hill, to this hill up behind the town. Well, all the guys started swearing. They were so pissed about the crescent moon pulling out on us and leaving us there. And it wasn't long after that a Confederate officer had rode up right to the courthouse and rode right into the courthouse on his horse and demanded our surrender. Well, the surgeons there said, there's nobody here but wounded men and us and the band members who were actually acting as nurses and bringing wounded men in. Well, he ordered the surgeons to have a band wrapped around their arm, a white band of cloth, so that they would know that they were nothing more than nurses. Well, he had left and we were there, and later on that evening, I tried to lay down. It was kind of hard because you didn't have our backpacks. We had dropped them when we came into the battle. We didn't have anything, blankets, nothing. We were just laying on a wooden floor. And one of our boys had come up, who was also from the 6th. He said, hey, there's a good place down at the train station. He said, we found some place to get comfortable for the night. So I'd gone down with Ticknor and a couple others, and we went down to the train station, and here there was an officer, and he was a cavalry officer, and he looked like a pretty young man. And some of the locals had put a feather bed out for him. and they had laid him on the feather bed, and they had some bedclothes on for him and a blanket and a small pillow. And he was laying there on his side, but he had died. And I was feeling so bad, I just didn't know. I thought, well, I got to lay somewhere. So I laid down beside him. And somewhere in the night, I fell asleep.
My name is Major General Abner Doubleday. On the 1st of July, 1863, I'm a career Army officer. I'm 44 years old. I'm in my 21st year of service. I'm one of several generals in the Army of the Potomac who are what I call Old Army. I graduated from West Point in 1842. I actually served in Mexico, served in Florida, and most famously during my time, I was actually part of the siege at Fort Sumter, which began the war. And I was well known, was able to procure general officer rank and positioning through that notoriety. In late June 1863, I am commanding 3rd Division of John Fulton Reynolds' 1st Corps. The day before the battle, on the 30th of June, General Reynolds summoned me to his headquarters and informed me that General Meade, the new Army of the Potomac commander, had appointed him commander of the left wing of the Army. That included General Reynolds' own 1st Corps, the 3rd Corps, and General Howard's 11th Corps. So because I was the senior division commander, he asked me at that time, the night before the battle, to assume command of the Corps. We had been positioned on the 30th of June, just a couple miles north of Emmitsburg along Marsh Creek, south of Gettysburg. I was summoned again to General Reynolds' headquarters at about 7 o'clock in the morning. He had received many communications from General Buford and told me he was going to take General Wadsworth's division, the 1st Division of the Corps, forward and relieve the pressure being felt by General Buford at that time, that morning. He instructed me to get the remainder of the Corps on the road and to engage at that location north and west of Gettysburg. I did that very quickly. As soon as I had 2nd Division under General Robinson and 3rd Division, my 3rd Division, I appointed General Rowley to be commander. As soon as they were ready to start order of march, I took my staff and with all possible haste proceeded north to the battlefield. When I heard the cannon fire, I knew I was close. I sent forward my aide, Lieutenant Martin, to find General Reynolds. He found General Reynolds. I received word back that General Reynolds wanted me to take the 2nd of 2 brigades of General Wadsworth's division, that's the Iron Brigade, the Western soldiers, and position them to the left of the Chambersburg Pike in what's called Herbst Woods, a position that we thought would be rather easy to defend on that side of the battlefield. Actually, that was around 10:15 when I had arrived. I was actually working with the Iron Brigade to position them in Herbst Woods. As you know, that Iron Brigade went down to Willoughby Run and surprised General Archer's brigade and actually routed them. Was able to capture 2/3 of that brigade, to include Archer himself. This was all happening simultaneously at around 10:15 when General Cutler was actually involved with the attack on Hall's Battery, the attack on the 147th New York, who had remained in the railroad cut. Around the same time, we received word that General Reynolds had been killed. At that moment, not only was I already commander of 1st Corps, I was actually the senior commander of those present from the Army on the battlefield at that time. I had kept the 6th Wisconsin from the Iron Brigade in reserve back at the seminary. I deployed them forward, and they, along with the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, were able to engage the Confederates and enabled the 147th to move back as far as Oak Ridge, and they continued to fire into that line. And they even captured one of Hall's guns that he had lost. At the conclusion of the deployment of the 6th Wisconsin in rescue of the 147th, the battlefield did die down a little bit. It came around 11 o'clock. We knew that early elements of Richard Baldy Ewell's corps were coming from the northwest and the north to the town of Gettysburg, to the left of A.P. Hill's corps troops, which we had been engaging all morning. Once General Howard arrived with the 11th Corps at 11, he became the senior commander on the field, and we, through messenger, were able to communicate that he needed to deploy the 11th Corps northwest and north of the town of Gettysburg to prepare for that onslaught of Ewell's divisions, specifically Rhodes and Jubal Early. They did so in the period between 11 and 1 o'clock. One of the problems which came to be an issue later was that 11th Corps' left flank left as much as a quarter-mile hole between that flank and General Cutler's right flank, our Corps right flank. So one of the first things I did when around 1 o'clock, the arrival of the 2nd Division, General Robinson Division, I actually deployed one of his brigades under Baxter to the right of General Cutler to help close some of that gap. There was still about 400 yards gap between that flank and the left flank at the 11th Corps at that time. It was about around this time, around 2 o'clock, that the battlefield warmed up once again. One of the brigades under Rhodes, specifically Iverson, some North Carolina folks, actually attacked Cutler and Baxter, and I was able to deploy in support of that the other brigade under Paul from the 2nd Division to shore up that line. The 3rd Division, my division under General Rowley, actually I deployed to beef up the center of our line between the right flank of the Iron Brigade and the left flank of the troops of Cutler's brigade, specifically the 95th New York and the 14th Brooklyn and the 6th Wisconsin were all in line at that point. This is how we received increasing numbers of pressure points left and right of the line from 2 o'clock through to about 4:30. It was a matter of trying to plug a hole, turning front, beating back an assault from both A.P. Hill soldiers as well as those of Ewell. It was around 4 o'clock that we discovered that the pressure from Ewell on the 11th Corps soldiers in the north was so great that they had begun their retrograde movement through the town of Gettysburg back to where General Howard had his headquarters, and that was Cemetery Hill. We maintained that position, as I thought General Reynolds' intent was when he positioned the Corps there in the morning. We maintained that position. We actually took a final line with support of both artillery and cavalry, Gamble's division, Gamble's brigade, over at the seminary itself. So we actually were being enveloped left and right by the Confederates by the time 4:30 came around, and it was at that point we ordered everyone to start moving back under covering fire from some of the regiments through the town of Gettysburg, which we had not moved through to arrive at the battlefield. We had arrived at the battlefield just to the west of Gettysburg. We did not know the town. In spite of that, the soldiers actually moved in relatively good order. We did run into some 11th Corps folks still moving back from the battlefield, and we actually met General Howard and by that time General Hancock on Cemetery Hill. And it was there that General Hancock, by order of General Meade, as he informed us, was now the senior commander on the field by virtue of that appointment. Even though General Howard outranked him and General Howard had a little bit of a problem with that for a few minutes, but he finally acquiesced, and it was General Hancock that positioned us. My particular corps ended up just to the west of Cemetery Hill, and the 11th Corps was in line to the left of us. It was at that point that the assaults actually abated from the Confederates, and we were able to consolidate for the night. And with that, that basically ended the action on day one of Gettysburg.